You think big supermarkets want your kids learning how great-grandparents survived on almost nothing? Think again. These corporations profit when families forget meals that stretched $1 into a week of dinners, recipes that kept bellies full during depressions, wars, and hardships they'd rather you never pass down. Here are 60 poverty meals big supermarkets don't want you teaching your kids. So lasagna soup is really as Italian as it gets. It was one of the most common recipes to make when people were coming out of the Depression, because it was extremely comforting and warm. It involved basically the entire blueprint of a lasagna, the pasta, meat, and vegetables, and yes, the unholy amounts of tomato sauce, but it was all in soup form. This dish was something people really treasured both for its taste and how easy it became to prepare it thanks to modern progressions in cooking appliances. You didn't have slow cookers that were half this good back in the 50s and 60s. One of the best reasons to make this dish was that it offered you a lot of nutrition for almost nothing. You could make this using leftovers, random scraps, or even vegetables that are different from what you typically order. This helps keep the soup fresh each time you make it, while also ensuring that it becomes your go-to for a health boost. Who wouldn't want that? Personally, I think the Italians really cracked the code on all this healthy eating stuff. What about you? Would you consider keeping lasagna soup as a side dish in your roster? Or are you a purist who swears there's nothing better than the classic layered, cheesy lasagna? Rolled flank steak was a much less expensive cut of beef. A lot of protein like fish and canned ham were used, but people couldn't really replace the need for beef. Of course, they had to make do. But that meant another thing. Less popular cuts of meat, ones that people normally wouldn't give a second glance to, became a lot more in demand. Naturally, you'd think that would mean they'd raise the prices, right? Not really, because then people would just buy the beef. Flank steak in particular was tougher and a lot more rubbery, but it was also really tender when you would slow cook it. It also helped matters that most home chefs knew their way pretty intimately around slow cooking. Next, you'd do whatever you could to make sure that the beef would last as long as possible. It was usually common to serve rolled flank steak with stuffing to make a pretty neat dish that required minimal beef. The stuffing itself was made from economy loaves, vegetables, and different kinds of herbs. An otherwise small and pretty hard-to-chew piece of meat would become a meal the whole family could look forward to, if you were willing to invest the hours it would take to make something of it. Most people were just happy to eat beef, though, which made the prep work just a bit more bearable. Remember when I said cornmeal was dirt cheap during the Dust Bowl era? Plus, it was almost everywhere, especially if you lived in Missouri or Kansas. Well, cornmeal mush was something Meemaw made every time we needed a nice, fulfilling meal. Think of it as the instant oatmeal of the Dust Bowl days. You just cooked cornmeal in water until it reached a thick, porridge-like consistency. It was often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar. Some folks even added a little molasses for extra flavor. Cornmeal mush was an affordable way to keep hunger at bay and provided a good source of energy. It wasn't a five-star meal, but it was dependable, much like the comfort of a warm blanket on a cold night. Meats and chicken were too expensive, so people had to make do with veggies like corn. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Carrot tops, the lost greens that were anything but lost during the Dust Bowl. When fresh vegetables were out of season, nothing was thrown away, not even the green tops of carrots. Carrot top salad made these usually discarded greens into a rather healthy meal. The greens were chopped, dressed with vinegar or lemon juice, and combined with any leftovers of vegetables or wild greens that could be found. If you were really fancy, you might add some more olive oil or a dash of salt. The result? A sharp, sour dish that was anything but luxurious, but was instead a nutritionist's dream. Carrot Tops have a robust, somewhat pungent taste, so they are considered a luxury item in today's terms. However, as they say, when the going gets tough, the tough get eating, and Dust Bowl families were certainly tough. Fun fact, Carrot Tops are not only edible, but also rich in nutrients such as vitamin K and other vitamins and minerals. I'd like to try this salad, perhaps, if there is enough dressing to offset the bitterness. It is not something I would run for, but I do appreciate the creativity of using leftovers to get food. If there is one thing that the Dust Bowl did, it showed that although survival may not always be pretty, it is always impressive. The underdog of the Great Depression pantry was turnips, the scrappy little root vegetable that was always at every table. Turnips, with their peppery bite and rock-bottom price, became the saving grace for families who were stretching every penny. Turnips were not just a root to roast, mash, or toss into soups, but a kitchen multitasker. So many families stockpiled turnips during those lean years because they could turn a bare-bones meal into something hearty and comforting with just one turnip. Poor soil was no problem for turnips, which made them a good crop for struggling farmers. In a root cellar, they could last for months without spoiling, making them ideal for winter when other fresh vegetables were long gone. But creative cooks came up with ways to bake them into casseroles, pair them with potatoes to stretch a mash further, or pickle them for a tangy treat. Sweetened turnip puddings, for instance, surprised many with their richness. Even desserts weren't off limits. Turnips aren't a staple of the grocery cart these days, but they've worked their way into farm-to-table menus and rustic recipes. They weren't a trendy choice back then, but they survived in vegetable form. If you go on over to central New York, specifically Utica, then you'll actually find an interesting bit of the local cuisine there known as chicken riggies. Tired of pastas? Give this one a shot. I promise it might turn your world upside down. This dish is entirely inspired by the Italian-American communities that are so dominant throughout Utica, and it's something that you can never go a day without seeing in upstate New York. The strong scent of hot peppers and chili flakes carries for miles, and it's that spice that people most strongly associate with a chicken riggie. This dish is pretty much named that entirely because it uses a lot of rigatoni pasta, which is the main star of the show here. It's made using chicken, cream, and all kinds of spices, and it even uses banana and cherry peppers. Come on, when's the last time you heard those names in a dish? I'll wait. Until you figure that one out, let's talk about some of the history here. This dish goes back to the 1970s, where it's really popular in Italian-American culture. A lot of people also think it started at the Colonial Restaurant in Utica, but that's not confirmed. Either way, this is one of the best regional dishes the states have to offer you. Potato cakes were pretty much the go-to option for almost everyone during the war period. You have to keep in mind that the country was still juggling the effects of the Great Depression too. Both of them in tandem really made it hard for people to get much else. As good as potatoes can be, especially when you serve them up in cake form, it can get a little stale. When you eat it as much as they did, it gets pretty hard to be excited for it. One way to really spice them up was to pair your potato cakes with fried onions. Sounds simple, but that's pretty much what sums up wartime cooking. Simple, efficient little tricks that make a world of difference. Potatoes were already a wartime staple. They were the easiest crop to grow around, and both rural farmers and government bigwigs took notice of that. This was a simple and amazing way to get some easy comfort and keep bellies full. Also, another thing that made these really easy was how much people traded potatoes and onions. It was really common to barter with vegetables. That meant that the recipe got around. It was in community cookbooks too, so there was no shortage of positive PR for it. I guess you could say it's pretty deserved, wouldn't you say? Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. In the Depression era, parsnips were Depression-era gold. They sweetened hard times with their distinct, not very exciting flavor. Parsnips were unlike finicky crops. They didn't mind poor soil or cold weather. In fact, a frost made them taste better. These pale cousins of the carrot were loved for their versatility and their ability to stick around all winter, making them a must-stock for any frugal household. If you had parsnips in the pantry, you were in for something delicious, or at least filling. Parsnips were boiled, roasted, or mashed, and were a blank canvas for creative cooks. They gave soups and stews a hint of sweetness, and could even be used in place of potatoes as a pinch. In fact, they were so reliable a crop that they often ended up in desserts, contributing their natural sugars to cakes, custards, and puddings. They weren't just tasty. They were nutritious and full of fiber, vitamins, and potassium. Parsnips have been trendy root vegetables for modern foodies, but in the 1930s, they were a staple that kept families from hunger. Chow chow is a pretty decent little dip in the southern side of America. Appalachian regions really just can't get enough of the stuff, and they definitely never fell out of the habit of pairing it up with most of their dishes. You could call it a pickled relish, but it's really just this dip made out of a cocktail of different greens and spices. You got your peppers, mustard seeds, cinnamon, and cloves, as well as cabbage, green tomatoes, and onions. It's actually a lot sweeter than you would originally think too, and really crunchy. People would chop the vegetables as finely as they could and mix them with vinegar, sugar, and spices to make this really vibrant brine, which stood out among other flavors at the time during the 20th century. The vegetables were also blanched and then placed in jars. The brine was then poured over them, and this would be sealed in jars so that it could marinate. It sounds simple enough, but it's a bit tricky, and even taking a bit of time away or leaving it in there for just a tad bit too long can mess with the flavors here. Let's stay in the South for a while. It's not all savory and spicy, they even have some great desserts. A pretty imaginative way of getting some familiar old flavors back into the weekly diet was mock food, specifically mock fish fillets. We're going to take a look this time at both this recipe and how exactly things like it became common. See, there's one thing about people from back then. While they definitely had it horrible, their circumstances really expanded their horizons in the kitchen. Mock culture was all about mimicking flavors of classic dishes with inexpensive ingredients. Stuff that was easy to get, wouldn't cut too deep into your pockets, and would also last you a good while. Mock fish fillets were actually made out of mashed potatoes. I really wasn't kidding when I said people really grew a newfound appreciation for potatoes. Recipes in cookbooks back then were using them in ways that the curly fries and hash brown-addled brains of you and I could only dream of. Still, there were times when even potatoes weren't available. In that case, they'd make use of bread. Now, you might naturally be wondering how bread even comes close to imitating the flavor of a fish fillet. Well, apparently, soaking it in some milk and mixing it with powdered eggs and flour actually forms a mixture that gets the texture down. Next, your spices: onion, parsley, pepper, and some pretty basic stuff, which was still easy enough to get. Though even those were stretched thin, spice cabinets would often run empty. Do you think this actually does the job? If you try it, share what you thought in the comments below. Hoover's stew got its name from President Hoover, who was blamed for the economic hardship of the 30s. It was a hodgepodge of whatever ingredients you had on hand, thrown together in a pot and cooked until it was tender. It might have included meat, potatoes, carrots, and other vegetables, and was a way to use up leftovers. The hot dogs provided protein, the canned vegetables added some much-needed nutrients, and the pasta helped to bulk up the dish. Hoover stew came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Folks had to pinch a penny so hard they'd make Lincoln cry, as they used to say. This stew is a tasty way to stretch $1 to feed more people or to make a meal with enough leftovers to take care of the next day's meals. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Imagine a meal that's as simple as it sounds. Cooked the flour and water and made dumplings. Now, I know you're wondering, that sounds like something you'd make on a sad Tuesday when you have nothing else in the pantry. Well, you're not wrong, but during the Dust Bowl, this was a hearty way to fill up a family when food was so scarce that even the pantry felt empty. The components in this dish were as simple as 1, 2, or 3: flour, water, and a pinch of salt. The dough was then molded into small balls and then placed in boiling water to be cooked. Yes, it was simple, but it was satisfying and had enough carbs to get people through the day. If you were lucky, you could put some herbs or a pinch of whatever spices remained to make it taste better. But mostly it was about existence, not feasting. The beauty of this dish was that it could be made in large batches, and while the flavor may not have been over the top, it could feed a family when they needed it most. The flour was the only real staple many families had, and it became the base for many meals. This simple dumpling dish was an example of how a little could be turned into something more. During the Great Depression, canned tomatoes were the unsung heroes, adding a splash of color and flavor to a drab dinner table. These little cans of sunshine were lifesavers, turning even the blandest of meals into something you could eat. Canned tomatoes were the Depression-era kitchen's MVP, the versatile ingredient that could be used in soups and stews, sauces and casseroles. Cheap, easy to store, and full of enough acid and flavor to perk up just about anything, including your spirits, they were. There was more to tomatoes than taste. They were nutritional powerhouses. They were high in vitamin C and helped keep scurvy at bay when fresh fruits were unavailable. And because they had a long shelf life, families could stockpile them without fear of spoilage. Families also canned tomatoes from their gardens to last them through the winter. Rows of gleaming mason jars in a cellar, each holding the promise of a warm, flavorful meal when times got tough, wasn't unusual. Canned tomatoes are still pantry staples today, but we might forget how simple they are. They weren't just a convenience back in the Depression, they were a lifeline. And sometimes the smallest luxuries can be the biggest. As far as names go, this is probably the most insulting one I've ever seen. But nonetheless, a garbage plate is a Rochester classic. And if you're ever in New York, you'd be doing yourself a disservice by not trying it. Yes, you heard me right. A garbage plate. Not following? I wouldn't blame you. If someone told me to eat that, I'd probably think they were making fun of me. In reality, though, a garbage plate is pretty much just this massive, behemoth-sized platter that you can really customize and adjust however you would like. Pasta fan? Throw in some macaroni and homemade fries. Meathead? You can't ever have enough ham, sausages, and chicken. Vegetable addict? Works for everyone. Still, who came up with such a massive display of gluttony? Nick Tahou Hots, which used to be one of the top restaurants in New York in 1918, founded by Nick Tahou, apparently made the dish for the first time. It was his way of giving customers the most bang for their buck and giving them a big meal for an affordable price. Quickly, it became a quintessential part of New York's street food culture and a symbol of the kind of indulgence you'd only find in the streets of New York City. The name itself apparently comes from how it looks, which, well, isn't really flattering. I'm going to have to go back to talking about how much we've borrowed from our British friends over in the United Kingdom. Bubble and squeak is quintessential British food after all. It was pretty genius too. This shares a theme with the picnic casseroles we just discussed because both were phenomenal ways to repurpose your leftovers. A lot of these dishes were powerhouses made exclusively out of stuff that was either left behind or simply was about to go bad. The earliest mention of bubble and squeak is in the 1700s, and that's just a pretty bare-bones meat and cabbage dish. Over time, it was adapted to the current situation, and meatless versions were made popular. These ones just prioritized using potatoes and vegetables, basically anything high in fiber. The reason you'd want that is because it'd keep you full for longer, which was always a godsend during the war. The potatoes would work as a binding agent. The leftover vegetables were chopped and mixed in for nutrition, and if you got super lucky, some corned beef or bacon would work really well for flavor. As far as the culture goes, Bubble and Squeak really emphasize the mentality of wasting absolutely nothing. Despite how humble the recipe is, it's definitely something that brought comfort to a lot of families. War or no war, who can say some mashed potatoes and greens haven't cheered them up at some point? Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy. literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Barley is not glamorous, but it was a culinary workhorse during the Great Depression. This ancient grain was a go-to ingredient for families who wanted to fill empty stomachs without emptying their wallets. Its biggest strength was its versatility. It gave soups and stews heartiness, porridge a stick-to-your-ribs breakfast, and even found its way into bread and dumplings. Depression-era dishes got a comforting depth from their chewy texture and nutty flavor, proving that simple ingredients could still be satisfying. Barley was a resilient crop, growing well on poor soil and surviving harsh weather, which farmers liked because it meant they could count on it to grow even in uncertain times. It is stored beautifully once harvested, good for months in cool, dry places. Barley thus became a staple of the pantry for rural families and urban households alike. Barley wasn't just about food, it was about community. In hard times, neighbors gathered to share recipes and tips for stretching their barley supply, creating a sense of community. Barley is today a niche ingredient, celebrated for its health benefits and rustic charm. During the Depression, it was a survival tool, showing that even the most humble grains could keep a family together through the worst of days. Back to the Appalachian region, and this time the Piedmont region as well, a sonker is one of the highlights of Northern Carolina cuisine. It's often served warm with like a generous scoop of ice cream, but it's actually a fruit dessert. These are really popular up in the South, you know? They get very serious about their fruit desserts. It's hard to find out where the dish first originated from, but lots of people believe that farming families that were trying to make the best out of their fruits are the first ones who found it. Actually, a lot of people seem to unanimously agree that it first popped up in Surry County. This is also where it's most well known, so maybe this one has a bit of truth to it. The city of Mount Airy in Surry County is also known for its massive use of sonkers and how it really doesn't ever let up on them. People there make these throughout the year, around the clock, and it's a point of competition for local bakeries too. Surry County even has Sonker Day, which is an annual event that celebrates the dessert. It's this community thing in Pilot Mountain, and people from around the place come and make their best version of a sonker, along with lots of other regional foods that have tons of history. The Sonker contest is one of the best things to check out in the area, so if you're ever around, give it a visit. Three-bean baked beans were one of the best hits to come out of wartime cooking. They were a great source of protein, easy to grow, and readily available. Plus, a pot of these beans would set you and your entire family up for the rest of the day, and probably the next one too. You really wanted recipes that didn't have a lot of specifics. You know those recipes on food blogs where if you substitute one or two ingredients, use what you have on hand and call it a day, it falls apart? Yeah, that was not the vibe here at all. If we're talking about the themes of wartime cooking, three-bean baked beans show us all of them. An adaptable recipe with ingredients you can find everywhere for cheap with a lot of crowd-pleasing ability. Basic beans like navy, kidney, and lima beans were used. If you were in the South, you'd probably see a lot more of black beans, which were actually given a little more credit. Any gym rats watching should note that they're better for protein. Not only was it really easy to make and prepare, it was also really comforting to hit. That goes double if we're talking about winters. And man, those winters were really harsh. Imagine a world without fancy desserts or indulgent snacks. Well, that pretty much sums up the Dust Bowl era for you. Enter milk toast, which was one of the only sweet treats offered in the 30s. Milk toast was a breakfast dish consisting of toasted bread and warm milk, typically with sugar and butter. Some fancier variations included salt, pepper, paprika, cinnamon, cocoa, and raisins. Milk toast was a popular food throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially for young children. Now, this was the first choice for those feeling under the weather back in the day. Yeah, it was the classic sick people food of the Dust Bowl era. Often served with a pat of butter or a sprinkle of sugar, milk toast was a gentle food that was easy on the stomach. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. When the chips are down, you have to work with what you have left in the kitchen or pantry. During the Dust Bowl, that creativity resulted in a dish like bird egg soufflé, a name that sounds like a fancy dinner party, but the reality was that it was a way to make the most out of very little. Bird eggs were one of the few sources of protein after the agricultural collapse that is depicted in the novel. The name soufflé may give one an idea that it is some light, airy French delicacy. This was not the case with the dish. The bird eggs, probably quail, chicken, or any other small bird eggs, were beaten and then cooked with whatever was available like cornmeal or flour to make it more filling. It was not about making it perfect, it was about making it edible. The soufflé was then baked, and you had a fluffy though rather plain meal to get you through the day. Eggs, being rich in protein, were a vital resource during the Dust Bowl. They could be prepared in different ways, scrambled, baked, or fried. Thus, a bird egg soufflé may not be a 5-star meal, but it could certainly give one the strength to go through a tough day on the farm. Would I eat it? Heck, yes. Who does not like a dish that involves eggs and ingenuity? Even if it is not a sophisticated soufflé that can be ordered in a French restaurant. Let's just forget about steak dinners. Canned fish was really the MVP during the Great Depression. Cheap and convenient protein for families on razor-thin budgets came in the form of sardines, salmon, and even mackerel, which found their way onto dinner tables across America. The ultimate grab-and-go meal was sardines packed in oil or water, straight from the can, smashed onto bread, or spread with a little mayo and a lot of hope they could be eaten. Canned salmon was a heartier option for casseroles, patties, and soups, stretching one can to feed an entire family. The salty, slightly fishy flavor wasn't for everyone, but when you were hungry, you didn't complain. There were other advantages to canned fish as well. It was shelf-stable, good for months without refrigeration, and small enough to transport. A favorite with travelers, hobos, and relief workers, it was a meal that even the most transient lives could count on. Canned fish is still around today, but it's not what it used to be. But in the 1930s, it was a lifesaver, showing that even the smallest catches could mean the biggest difference when times were tough. Chicken bogs are some of the best things you can ever get in South Carolina. They're a classic in the Low Country, and it's one of the best one-pot dishes ever made in the country. This dish makes full use of chicken, rice, and sausage, and you know that any rice-chicken combination is a classic format for comfort food. This uses andouille, which is a type of smoked sausage that's known exclusively for its strong flavor. Then sometimes there are vegetables and chicken thighs in the broth. The big part of the names actually comes from the fact that it's a broth that is really heavy on the slow cooking. The rice also absorbs all of the broth, and this gives it an almost porridge-like texture and consistency, but an extremely rich flavor that you wouldn't find anywhere else. You can find this in North Carolina and Georgia too, and it's one of the most effective meals for big families. That state has always had a high population and a culture of big families, so it makes sense that dishes like these got popular there. Another thing that's really popular is the Hemingway Chicken Bog Festival, which actually does get held every year in Hemingway in South Carolina. As you can probably guess, the theme is exclusively chicken bogs. Lima bean soup is a little different. See, they wanted to scoop up all the grade A stuff, the easy sources of protein. I mean, you'd be pretty right in thinking that includes beans too, and yeah, lots of soldiers ate canned beans and soups made out of various beans. Luckily for everyone, there was, for once, just once during the war, enough to go around most of the country. Lima beans in particular were really popular throughout the Midwest and the South. Let me talk a little about what wartime cooking did for soups, though. While they were never really hurting for love or attention, you couldn't exactly call a bowl of soup the main attraction. Maybe today, in gourmet dining circles, that kind of thing could fly, but back then, there wasn't enough value for money. That quickly changed once people realized soups are actually a lot better all around when you make them at home. I'm not talking about taste, since that was still something people took time to get used to. I'm talking about utility. A soup can be readjusted so many times. It takes literally nothing but water as a base to make, and it can go around an entire large family. That's the kind of thing you hold on to tight during an economic breakdown, and nothing shows that better than Lima bean soup. Now people who had chickens as pets had the luxury of eating hard-boiled eggs for breakfast. Let's be honest, we all love a sunny side-up, but hard-boiled eggs just hit differently. This classic breakfast food got a workout during the Dust Bowl. Eggs were a valuable source of protein and could be stored for a longer time. Eggs, when hard-boiled, had a longer shelf life compared to raw eggs. This made them a practical choice for preservation, as they could be stored and used over time without spoiling quickly. Plus, boiling eggs is easy no matter how challenging the times get. They could be sliced into salads, added to casseroles, or simply enjoyed as a snack. These weren't just a breakfast item. These eggs were also used in dinner meals and were often served with white sauce over rice. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. When the cupboard was empty and the garden was dust, you made rag soup. Well, they did not boil actual rags, praise heavens, but because this soup was made from the scraps so lowly that it was like throwing rags into a pot. Rag soup was made from water, a couple of carrots, or any other vegetable that was left rotten and, at most, a piece of meat or a bone if one were to be lucky. It was thin, hardly spiced, and was stretched to go around the whole family. You can consider it as the soup where the idea is more important than the substance. The beauty of rag soup was that it was a very versatile dish. Got a carrot and a potato? In they go. Found a pinch of salt? Jackpot. It was a meal that was prepared in a time of famine and at the same time creativity. And though it was simple, it gave heat and food during the worst conditions. Rag soup is evidence of the fact that Dust Bowl families were able to survive and cook something tasty even out of the scraps. The Great Depression was no reason to skip gelatin packets, which were pantry staples and culinary alchemy in powdered form. Gelatin was a cook's best friend because of its uncanny ability to turn liquid into solid, allowing it to stretch ingredients farther than anyone thought possible. Why was gelatin so popular during the Depression? First of all, it was cheap and easy to store. The packets could sit on the shelf indefinitely, waiting for the day when a family had to pull something out of the cupboard, something that looked like a real meal. Gelatin was even used to make mock recipes that looked like expensive foods, so families could enjoy a taste of luxury on a shoestring budget. In the 1930s, gelatin was a sign of ingenuity and resourcefulness, but today it conjures up images of wobbly Jell-O molds at family gatherings. Its culinary heyday may be over, but gelatin is a nostalgic reminder of how far creativity can go when times are hard. Gooey butter cake is arguably the top dog in terms of desserts and things to eat. People love it for two reasons. Gooey butter cake became a hit in the 1980s as a wallet-friendly dessert, perfect for potlucks, bake sales, or family gatherings. Its simple ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, and a generous amount of butter meant it was affordable to make and easy to share. During tough economic times, home bakers loved that this rich, indulgent cake would feed a crowd without breaking the bank. You couldn't beat that texture, and the buttery flavor is exactly what you need after a long shift in the summer heat. This cake is made with more butter than any doctor will say is safe for you, but the end result is just too delicious to pass up on. A lot of people seem to think that the dish's origins are rooted in German and Eastern European immigrants that first came on over and settled down in St. Louis. It's actually so deeply associated with the area that the other name for this dish is the St. Louis gooey butter cake. It really lives up to that name too, because that gooey filling on the inside is nothing short of heavenly. It's something that tourists stop in the area for and try all the time, and the locals just can't ever seem to get enough of it. Smoked picnic ham with brown sugar was another really inexpensive way to stretch ingredients without breaking the bank. You might not know, but refined sugar actually pretty much became a myth in homes back then. In more bougie neighborhoods, sure, you'd pop open a cabinet and see some sitting pretty, but for everyone else, that just wasn't the case. Refined sugar was a rarity and also an expensive ingredient to buy. Brown sugar, on the other hand, was the perfect fix. Cheap, available easily, and barely distinguishable, it was the backbone of a lot of wartime cooking. Also, the smoked picnic ham isn't really authentic either, at least not in the way you're thinking. Ham usually is made from the hind leg, but picnic ham is cured, and it's cut out of the shoulder. It's got mostly the same texture, but it's a bit on the cheaper side because it's tougher and has a higher fat percentage, which wasn't really a bad thing. I mean, the people were definitely lacking some of that in their diet. Smoked picnic hams with brown sugar were most regularly made around things like Thanksgiving and Christmas. It was a nifty little way to make everyone feel like they were celebrating. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously, and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then, and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, It was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? No, this isn't a prank. There really was a dessert called sawdust pie, and people really did make it during the Dust Bowl. And yes, sawdust was used. Okay, not the sawdust in the literal sense, but the breadcrumbs or other leftovers that created the dry and crumbly feel of the pie. It was made sweeter, flavored with spices, and baked into a product that looked like a dessert. The main ingredient was frugality. Staple ingredients such as flour and sugar were rationed, and therefore cooks had to make do with available ingredients. Breadcrumbs, crushed crackers, or even ground nuts, if one had been fancy, became the base for this pie. A little molasses or syrup added, and you'd have a dish that might not win the bake-off but can do the job of satisfying a craving in the middle of the night. The name sawdust pie alone would turn anyone's stomach, but it was actually food and, I must admit, rather creative. It was not about opulence. It was about turning the essence of food into a dessert, literally a crumb. Today, there are still recipes for sawdust pie, but they use coconut and pecans to make it a little bit more fancy. Would I try it? Of course, if someone says it is the new style and not the original straight from the Dust Bowl, because even a pie that goes by the name of sawdust needs a bit of appreciation, doesn't it? Powdered milk was there to step in when fresh milk wasn't an option. Powdered milk was a marvel of food science, transforming surplus dairy into a shelf-stable product that didn't require refrigeration, a crucial feature for families without electric iceboxes during the Great Depression. Technically, a few scoops of powder whisked into the water made a liquid that resembled milk. The taste was more chalky than creamy, and the fresh stuff had a richer flavor. But powdered milk wasn't about luxury. It was about survival. It was a base for soups, sauces, and baked goods, making it one of the most versatile Depression-era pantry items. Families with children found powdered milk especially important because it meant kids got a steady supply of calcium and protein, even when fresh dairy was not available. It was also affordable, which meant it became a favorite among relief programs, which distributed it to struggling households. Powdered milk was a lifeline for families living far from the nearest dairy farm in rural areas where refrigeration was scarce. Today, powdered milk is used mostly for emergencies and backpacking trips, but it played a big role during the Great Depression. It was a symbol of ingenuity and resilience, taking something as simple as milk and turning it into a survival tool in a world of scarce resources. Minnesota's always a place you associate with big families that like to hold even bigger feasts. Naturally, in such a place, dishes that have a lot of crowd-pleasing abilities take first place. Hot dishes, which are a type of casserole, fit that bill perfectly. For the longest time, hot dishes have been a massive part of the comfort food traditions of America. But that couldn't be truer than it is for Minnesota. Ground beef, pasta, peas, green beans, and corn, and the creamiest and cheesiest sauce you know are the tricks to making a good hot dish. And it's something that Minnesotans just can't seem to replace. A lot of people actually seem to think that this love of a hot dish comes from the struggles Minnesota suffered throughout the post-World War II and Great Depression periods. Back then, it was extremely vital that people prepare dishes that could feed entire families with minimal ingredients. As the name implies, it's also pretty hot, which makes it perfect for the winters and for reheating it. Potlucks and casseroles were always something that was really popular in America, especially in Minnesota, and this casserole is textbook proof of that never-ending trend. Fish soufflé and baked potatoes were a wonderful combination, the kind of thing that just bounces off of the beach of its different parts and sides. The fish soufflé, along with a generous serving of baked potato, wasn't just delicious, it was also extremely nutritious. This was probably one of the recipes that kept up health the most throughout the whole ordeal. You might be wondering how fish was common enough for the recipe to have this kind of weight behind it. It just so happens that if you lived near a coastal city back then, you were definitely in luck, at least compared to the rest of the population. Fishing skyrocketed, not as a hobby this time, but as a necessary skill. Fish were plentiful, and most of all, they were free. They were the main source of nutrition for a lot of places. When people had no use for fish as food, they'd sell it to make some quick money, and get whatever necessities they needed. Besides, it was common enough to get things like crab in the waters back then too. We've got one thing straight: meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work, as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. You may think of weed as something you don't want in your garden, but during the Dust Bowl, it was the only thing that could keep people alive. Weed and root stew was another dish that families who were surviving on the edge of starvation could afford, which meant even the most unappetizing plants could save lives. This stew was full of wild greens, dandelions, lamb's quarters, purslane, things you dig up in the garden with your fingers. The stew was not gourmet, but it was filling. The weeds and roots were boiled in water with whatever scrap of meat or bone one could come across, a piece of chicken that had been used the previous day or some beef if one were lucky. The trick was to make it filling, and wild greens can do that. The taste was not gourmet, but hearty. It would not be a restaurant of the stars, but a restaurant of the gut. The roots were sometimes starchy, which was good enough for making a soup. Although calling it weed might not exactly make your mouth water today, wild plants were a great source of vitamins and minerals, much more than that yellowing lettuce in the back of the fridge. Would I eat it? Frankly, if I were in the Dust Bowl, I'd take that weed stew and turn it into my gourmet dish. It is evidence that when it comes to seasoning, desperation is the best thing. The Depression-era workhorse of the pantry was cracked wheat, which turned simple grains into meals that fed body and soul. This unassuming staple was cheap, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, a lifeline for families trying to stretch a dollar. Cracked wheat was boiled into a porridge-like breakfast, used in place of pricier grains in bulk soups, or simply used as a cheap alternative to pricier grains. This coarse, nutty grain wasn't just filling, it was packed with nutrition, providing a steady supply of fiber, protein, and vitamins. It stored beautifully in burlap sacks, ready to rescue meals when other ingredients ran out, and its long shelf life made it ideal for stockpiling. Cracked wheat was baked into bread or stuffed into vegetables to make a hearty dinner. In fact, it was used to stretch ground meat in patties or meatloaves, so a little meat went a long way. Cracked wheat doesn't enjoy the spotlight these days, but it's a staple in many cuisines around the world, and so its staying power is proven. It wasn't a trendy health food back in the 1930s. It was survival on a plate. Cracked wheat, chewy and cracked, tasted of resilience and making do with what you had in every bite. So the best part about going to South Carolina is easily the Frogmore stew that you can find in the low-country parts of the state. Despite what the name implies, rest assured, there aren't any toads or frogs that will jump out from your bowl of stew. It's just a small little reference to Frogmore. This is a community that you can find in St. Helena Island, located in South Carolina. It's said that this is where the dish first came from, and it's a one-pot boil that's become pretty closely associated with Carolina cuisine. This seafood boil pretty much is made of all the basic ingredients you would imagine modern boils to use. You have your mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, shrimp, vegetables, and spices, and it really is one of those crowd-pleasing dishes I talked about earlier. It's nearly impossible to go wrong with this dish because it's got a lot of variety. If you're sitting with a group of people who aren't the biggest fans of shrimp, you can throw in some cod, some oysters, or crab. Whatever kind of seafood gets the current group going, it can work in frogmore stew. Since this is entirely a boil, it's also pretty nutritious. This is part of why the dish got so popular, since people living on the Carolina coast would rely on one-pot boils like these, which made use of the catch of the day. You'll see a lot of main ingredients being replaced with affordable and convenient substitutes here. It was just how you did things back then. People weren't exactly living the picture of fine dining back then. Scalloped potatoes and chopped picnic casseroles were recipes that really stuck true to that entire concept. So scalloped potatoes have been a favorite all over the States, and that only became more true during the war, but what about those casseroles? Well, normally this is just what you would call a leftover casserole. That's literally what it was, since a lot of people just used the recipe as a way to get rid of leftovers, which is also why it didn't see a lot of use back when things were okay. Skip to the 40s, though, and you'll see nothing but praise for this dish. The concept here is a dish that's ready to eat right out of the fridge. Stale bread, crackers, canned meats like Spam, bits of sausages, and anything that could count as leftovers worked. Sometimes neither the scalloped potatoes nor the casserole was substantial enough on its own to fill a family. Put 2 and 2 together, and you have the closest thing to a picnic that you could get back then. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the Dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup, especially in the winters when people needed nutrition more than ever. Don't underestimate the versatility of cotton. It is not only used to produce clothes. When the Dust Bowl hit, farmers learned that they could take cottonseed, no joke, it's a byproduct of cotton cultivation, and make a loaf of something that could be eaten. Cottonseed loaf was the ultimate frugal meal, the idea of turning what was essentially waste into the main course. Cottonseed was poisonous and had to be cooked to remove the poison. Then it was ground and then added to flour, water, and whatever spices and leftovers people had. It's sort of like a meatloaf's distant relative, only there is no meat and, well, there's not a whole lot of taste. The loaf was heavy, tough, and by no means delicious, but it was quite healthy to sustain the people. The idea was not entirely radical. Cottonseed is very high in protein, and since it was already being fed to animals, it was only a short jump to try it out on humans. Spoiler alert, they could, but at the cost of a little pain. When the options are between cottonseed loaf and nothing, then the cottonseed loaf does not look too bad at all. Moreover, it is a good lesson on how people have to exist with what they have, even if what they have is cotton. For a generation that lived through the Depression, saltine crackers were Depression-era superheroes in disguise as mere squares of humdrum dough. Saltines stretched scarce ingredients further, providing the fill-in-the-gaps when bread, flour, or even meat ran short. Break them into milk for breakfast? Done. Canned goods? Layer them with them for a makeshift casserole? Absolutely. A rare treat. Toast them with cheese? Heaven on a plate. Saltines were cheap, long-lasting, and endlessly useful, so families stockpiled them. Because they were shelf-stable, they stayed fresh for months, a game-changer when grocery trips were out of the question. Saltines were also a change in texture and flavor from food that got monotonous, which was often the case during the Depression. They were neutral, so whatever was on hand could be put on them: peanut butter, jelly, or leftover gravy. Today, they're often overshadowed by their fancier cracker cousins, but saltines still have a nostalgic charm. In the 1930s, they were more than a snack. They were a survival tool, and sometimes the simplest things were the biggest things. Gnudi is an Italian dish that we take from Umbria, and they're actually pretty similar to gnocchi. Imagine if you made your gnocchi with ricotta cheese and starches instead of the typical stuff. Gnudi, funnily enough, actually means naked in Japanese, and it's a clever little joke too, since gnudi isn't made with any kind of pasta wrapping like your typical gnocchi is. So, one of the reasons this dish got really popular was because of how badly people wanted to show off their skill in the kitchen. The big thing here was nailing the burro noce, or the brown butter sauce, and shaping and poaching the gnudi. It took a lot of precise, detail-oriented skill to shape the gnudi, and that meant that you only made it if you were comfortable with your skill in the kitchen. So you might be surprised to hear party franks on this list. Just because the times were as tough as they were doesn't mean people forgot how to have fun. Party franks today are pretty much just an appetizer at family gatherings and potlucks, but back then, it was totally different. There was this entire concept of community-based cooking that was pretty much exclusive to that time period. Neighborhoods would pool their resources and pantries together. They'd cook up a storm for the whole block, and it would leave everyone fulfilled and satisfied. The idea was that people would get more variety, nutrition, and overall food if everyone shared an agreed amount from the get-go. Party franks were perfect for situations like this because it was extremely easy to prepare for an entire group of people. When I say group, I mean at least a dozen plus, not a family of 4. You'd have pigs in a blanket with sausages wrapped in leftover dough, or you'd have them sliced into tiny bits and added to stews, soups, and sometimes even sandwiches. It was a little way to add some flavor and style to otherwise pretty plain meals. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. This is not a joke, but the next thing you will be hearing is peanut butter and onions. Exactly, during the Dust Bowl, people could not afford to use peanut butter in sweet spreads, so they had to make do with what they had, which was to add a savory touch to the sandwiches. The peanut butter and onion sandwich came from the need to have a salty, protein-rich sandwich that has a kick from the onion. Well, this may sound like the most unusual pairing you've ever come across, but the components were basic. A thick layer of peanut butter, onions thinly sliced, and served on any bread that was available. It was a good blend of the creamy, nutty taste of the peanut butter and the sharp, pungent taste of the onions, at least when one is hungry enough to take it. The sandwich may have been a bit of a shock to the taste buds, but it did the trick of providing a quick meal with protein, complex carbohydrates, and fat. Also, it did not cost much and was filling, two important factors during the Dust Bowl. Okay, it may seem strange, but if you had to endure the Dust Bowl, you would not think twice about making a sandwich with peanut butter and onions. It's a rather perverse example of how food innovation thrives under pressure. Dried peas may be the wallflowers of the legume world, but they were the unsung heroes of many kitchens during the Great Depression. These little green powerhouses were tiny, nutrient-packed, and incredibly cheap, just the kind of food that families could stretch their food budgets as far as possible. In particular, split peas shone brightly as the star ingredient in hearty soups and stews. A handful of vegetables, maybe a scrap of salt pork, simmered with a pot of water made a meal that could warm bellies and spirits. The peas themselves were a solid dose of protein for those who couldn't afford meat and helped families stay nourished when times were tough. A near-infinite shelf life also came from dried peas. They could be stored in jars or cloth sacks and could last for years, making them a reliable choice for households that wanted to prepare for lean months. Peas were often grown by rural families, which dried and preserved them for the winter, or city dwellers went to market stalls to get their supply. Dried peas have been overshadowed by the flashier ingredient, but their legacy remains. They remind us that sometimes the simplest foods are the most dependable, feeding families through economic storms with a few handfuls of green perseverance. Pepperoni rolls are actually a pretty iconic and beloved snack if you go on over to West Virginia. A lot of people think that this has to do with how the snack has its roots deep in the Italian immigrant communities that have settled down there and made a home throughout the 20th century, but I also think it's this general trend of Americans preferring Italian and French food. A lot of miners would eat these rolls, though, especially in the towns that were really known for mining. Pepperoni rolls remained popular through the 1980s, especially as a budget-friendly meal option during economic downturns. Their portability made them a go-to for busy families and workers looking for quick, affordable lunches. Unlike pricier deli meats or elaborate sandwiches, pepperoni rolls offered a satisfying blend of protein, carbs, and flavor at a low cost. Plus, their shelf stability meant they could be packed ahead of time for school lunches, road trips, or shift work. The rolls were made out of your typical pastry dough and stuffed to the brim with cheese and pepperoni, and they became a staple of all kinds of local bakeries. You could even find to-go versions for sale in convenience stores, and if you wanted rolls that looked fancier, then you'd go for the ones served at restaurants. Scrambled eggs had a massive makeover during the World War. It was a lot more common to add chopped parsley and chives to them rather than bacon and hash browns. Rationing efforts meant that a lot of basic ingredients were amiss, not just meat. While people were fighting over scraps of bacon, the sudden egg shortage really took them by surprise. Eggs were a pretty common breakfast, which I think is true of anywhere in the world. They were also a wonderful source of protein, so I'm sure you can figure out why the government wanted all the eggs to themselves. Dried, powdered eggs supplemented with water were used instead. You'd use the water and whisk them until they'd reach something that still resembled the texture of a fresh egg. Then, if you could afford to, you'd use some powdered milk to further make it resemble your typical plate of scrambled eggs. That raised another concern, which was, well, the powdered eggs are running out too fast. The solution people came up with at that point was to use fillers like vegetables, the parsley and chives, to fatten the egg up a bit. Make it a bit more substantial, you know? I have to say, I think they did a pretty clean job with it. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, the leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available. Things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Dried navy beans are the perfect meal when you're on a budget and want something filling and endlessly adaptable. These humble legumes were a lifesaver during the Great Depression, when meat was out of reach, providing protein and sustenance. Their small size and mild flavor made them a good base for soups and stews, baked beans, and bean patties. Navy beans were ridiculously economical as well. That single bag could feed a family for days, especially if you add rice, cornbread, or whatever odds and ends were in the pantry. They lasted practically forever on the shelf, and that made them an excellent stockpile item for lean times. The best part? These little powerhouses were nutritional dynamos, packed with fiber, protein, and iron, just what you needed to keep energy up when work was hard and food was scarce. Navy beans were transformed into savory dishes seasoned with salt pork and sweetened bean pies that were surprisingly tasty. They weren't exactly exciting, but they were reliable, and that's what mattered. Navy beans are still a staple in many kitchens today, but back then they were a symbol of survival. Depression-era families depended on them, simple, sturdy, and essential, one bowl at a time. Divinity Candy, for example, is this wonderful nougat that's made out of the simplest ingredients ever and just enough vanilla to make your day. It's light, airy, and pretty flavorful, and it makes a lot of use of a 20th century classic. Corn syrup was something that the country couldn't live without, and that was largely because of how popular it got during the wartime period. Divinity Candy is made out of a meringue that has an egg white base, and it involves beating those eggs and mixing them in with the syrup until you get this really glossy mix. After you've gotten the right consistency, and that's really critical here, you just pipe it onto some good wax paper and let it set and cool. It's crunchy since it uses pecans, but every bite really has a lot of sweet and warm flavors to it, which makes the overall experience absolutely amazing. It's the perfect thing to eat after a big barbecue platter or something that really takes your digestive system for a spin. Cherry tomato salads are pretty much just a really refreshing way to utilize your tomatoes. Thanks to Victory Gardens, which was a concept that spread like wildfire, all sorts of people were getting first-hand farming experience. When you get into that sort of thing, you soon realize the prestige of a tomato. It's one of the heaviest hitters when it comes to fruits. If you think I'm overrating it, well, I won't bore you with all the benefits of a tomato, but I will let you in on how easy they are to grow. These things can be grown from February to mid-March outdoors or indoors, in the ground or in a pot. This made them perfect for victory gardens. But tomatoes on their own aren't something you can do a lot with. That's where cherry tomato salads come in. This was a light-hearted, refreshing salad that really put some energy back into you, and it was pretty needed too. After a long day of working in subpar environments and just constantly being in bad living conditions, people's bodies really needed a good salad to jolt them awake. Plus, it always made for a wonderful breakfast. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. During the Great Depression, walnuts and pecans weren't just a tasty snack, they were a prized resource for cash-strapped families. These nuts could be harvested, stored, and used to jazz up otherwise plain meals if you had access to a tree or a generous neighbor. Cracking nuts was labor-intensive, but the payoff was worth it. A rich, fatty ingredient that gave texture and flavor to bread and cookies, stuffing, and casseroles. In the South, pecans were a common sight, falling straight from the trees and into resourceful hands for those lucky enough to live there. The shells of walnuts were tougher, but the reward was similar. Nuts were also very nutritious, with healthy fats, protein, and vitamins that were hard to find in other foods, and they stored well and could even be bartered or sold when money was tight. Depression-era families used them to make nut-based candies, nut milk, and even to top their cornbread pudding. Classic Southern pies needed pecans, and walnuts made their way into cakes and confections. Walnuts and pecans were a luxury that came from nature in a time of indulgences that were rare. Back then, they were a little piece of heaven in tough times, and today, they're a treat. Barbecue spaghetti is a Memphis, Tennessee classic, and it takes the best of both worlds. You have barbecue, which is something that Memphis swore long ago that it couldn't live without, and you have spaghetti. Memphis-style barbecue works extremely well with spaghetti because it has a big focus on the smoky and tangy side of things. This barbecue uses a sauce that's made out of marinara and a tomato-based barbecue sauce too, which is a big part of what gives it that smoky flavor. Then, you have your pulled pork and chicken, along with some classics like bell peppers and garlic, which give the dish its finishing touches as far as flavor is concerned. Despite its status as a regional classic, this is really just a new dish that only recently made its name in the Memphis food scene. It wasn't always there, but what was a big and ancient part of Memphis tradition is barbecuing. You could just consider this another successful experiment in that long-lasting tradition. It's originally believed that African American communities came up with barbecue spaghetti, and it was probably a way to get rid of leftover meat. Since there probably wasn't enough to constitute a full plate, people would often mix it with any kind of grain or starch to get a full meal. This next one is sautéed liver with tomato sauce. Okay, I get it. No one's that big of a fan of liver. I wouldn't blame you because, to be honest, I can't really get with it either. Actually, the government wouldn't blame you either, because they're the same. Not sure what I mean? Rationing efforts were actually decided by what seems to be a group of picky eaters. Remember how, when we were talking about rolled flank steak, we went over the fact that it was a less popular cut of meat? That was true for like a million other things. Rationing efforts focused most on premium cuts of meat, fresh produce, and popular vegetables. The stuff that wasn't so up to quality was left behind for the people. I guess it kind of makes sense, but also, wouldn't you be happy to get whatever meat you could during a war? That's definitely how the people back at home felt. Thanks to all of this, liver became insanely more popular. A lot of people realized the health benefits of it and how nutritious it was, and began using it in their daily diet. I guess you really can acquire any taste. Would you give liver a fair shot today? Or is that a little past our comfort zone? What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to, because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten. Not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. During the Great Depression, corn syrup wasn't just a sweetener, it was liquid gold. It was cheap, endlessly versatile, a pantry staple that helped stretch sugar supplies and satisfy sweet cravings when dessert options were slim. Corn syrup was a baking ingredient, but it was also a problem-solving ingredient. It sweetened oatmeal, preserved fruits, replaced expensive honey or maple syrup, and even found its way into homemade candies and frostings. Corn syrup was the next best thing for families with a sweet tooth but no budget to indulge. One of its hidden talents? It also acts as a secret weapon in making food last longer. Jams and jellies were often made with corn syrup to keep them fresh for months. It also ended up in Depression-era classics like pecan pie or molasses cookies, where it gave simple ingredients a rich, gooey texture that made them seem decadent. Modern critics might snicker at corn syrup's nutritional downsides, but during the Depression, no one cared. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it kept families fed. It was a small but meaningful taste of happiness for kids lucky enough to get a corn syrup-laced treat. Scrapple is this meat pudding that's pretty much made out of trimmings, scraps, your typical offal. Then you throw in some pork loaf and cornmeal, and we really start to smell some flavors coming together. It's got a pretty grainy texture and is made entirely out of pork fat, and it's one of the most common things in mid-Atlantic regions. Whether you find yourself in the trenches of New Jersey, surrounded by deli food in Virginia, or whether you can't get a decent meal in Delaware, you can always rely on some budget-friendly diner serving scrapple. It's actually this European dish that settlers used really popularly throughout the region, especially in Pennsylvania. Did you know that place used to be the #1 spot for German immigrants to go to? It's where the very first German immigrants began to settle down, after all. I really mean it when I say they didn't let anything go to waste. You might shiver at the thought of hot braised beef tongue, but back then, it was a proper delicacy. I'm serious. Forget tongue, they even ate cow brains. Beef tongue was pretty much a staple of homemade cooking during the wartime and the Depression. If you thought being resourceful meant eating one more fruit a day and mixing some veggies in, this is going to show you just how serious it actually was for people. Organ meats were really in high demand for a particular reason. They weren't rationed, and if they were, then the state's grip on it wasn't half as tight. Obviously, right? Tongues aren't notorious for their easy handling or how convenient they are to prepare. Instead, the government thought about killing two birds with one tongue and promoted the use of organ meats even further. This otherwise really tough slab of meat was made super soft, tender enough that it was familiar to the American palate via braising. Now, that had a trade-off. It meant that you had to slow cook this for a majority of the day. That's why braised beef tongues weren't a daily dish, but they were definitely regular enough. Luckily, not every community in America saw this as a shock. Latin American and Jewish communities were pretty used to eating beef tongue, and even Muslim ones pitched in with their best recipes and tricks. Last but not least, mulligan stew was the ultimate Dust Bowl survival dish. The Dust Bowl era was a time of scarcity, and people had to get creative with their meals. Mulligan stew was the epitome of this resourcefulness. It was a one-pot wonder, made with whatever ingredients were on hand. Meat, potatoes, carrots, and any other leftover vegetables could find their way into the pot. Mulligan stew might not have had a consistent recipe or flavor, but its purpose was clear: to provide a hearty, nourishing meal from whatever could be salvaged. So, which of these Dust Bowl foods would you have loved? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the video, give us a like and subscribe. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. For every great food substitute out there is always a terrible one out there as well. One of the more eccentric replacements was turnip coffee. Yes, you read that right, turnips instead of coffee beans during the Dust Bowl. At some point, coffee became too expensive or scarce and people had to improvise, and turnips became the new hero. The process included roasting turnips, grinding them to resemble coffee, and boiling them to make a drinkable concoction. Yes, it was not as delicious as the real coffee, But it was warm, it contained caffeine, sort of, and people got that extra dose of energy they needed. Moreover, it was not nearly as expensive as the real thing. It is hard to believe today, but turnip coffee was a great idea to solve a significant issue at that time. Turnips were easy to grow, they were abundant, and they could satisfy that hunger that comes with the loss of a beloved caffeinated beverage. Frankly, I'd like to try it only for the sake of trying it, but I guess I would need some really powerful cream to make it all possible. It's probably one of the most unique ways to get your coffee intake for the day, though. During the Great Depression, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable, it was practically a survival mascot. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and ridiculously versatile, and it became a Depression-era darling. Cabbage stretched meals and stomachs alike, whether it was boiled, fried, pickled, or turned into sauerkraut. Cabbage's long shelf life was one of its biggest selling points. A head of cabbage could be stored for weeks, making it a perfect stockpiling food. It was also a prolific grower that did well in backyard gardens and was an endless source of greens for frugal families. It was a powerhouse nutritionally, with vitamin C, fiber, and antioxidants to ward off illness and keep people going. A popular option was pickling cabbage into sauerkraut to add tangy flavor and preserve the vegetable for months. During the Great Depression, cabbage was a lifesaver, but today it might not seem glamorous. The humble charm of it is that it is so adaptable and can turn the simplest of ingredients into something satisfying. Johnny Marzetti is a dish, not a person, and it's one that's entirely tied to the history of food in Ohio. While people debate the exact circumstances that led to this dish, there's no doubt that it was named after the real-life Johnny Marzetti, who was a restaurant owner up in Columbus, Ohio. His entire family owned what was known as the Marzetti Italian restaurant during the early years of the 20th century, and the most commonly accepted origin story is that this dish actually began here. It was something so popular that people started to associate the Marzetti name with it, and it was their best-selling pasta. What people don't know for sure is whether the dish was something that just caught a catchy name or whether it was Johnny Marzetti's magnum opus. All we do know is that around the 1950s and 60s, you started hearing this name a lot more commonly. In the Midwest regions, it was known for being on school lunch menus and for its ability to feed an entire busy family with almost no effort. Wartime living during World War II really shows you how much people worked with so little. During the war, butter and margarine were rationed pretty extensively too. That basically meant your local diet had a big void where fats should be, and that wasn't good for anyone. You'd need that stuff to cook or bake and just to get on with your week. Dripping was people's easy, one-stop solution to this crisis. When you'd roast meat, you'd get drippings from it. This wasn't just used once, but again and again as many times as possible. Pork or beef fat is another term for dripping, and it's still used in places today. But during the war, every home was working like this. There was such a strong mentality of not letting even a single part of an animal go to waste, and that didn't just include the meat and bones, but also the fat. I guess it's pretty admirable how much the brain can think of when you find yourself in situations like this. Now, beans were a staple, and pairing them with ham was a Southern favorite. It was a hearty meal that would stick to your ribs. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good bowl of beans and ham hocks? A variation of this was known as the United States Senate bean soup, or simply Senate bean soup, which was a soup made with navy beans, ham hocks, and onion. It was served in the dining room of the United States Senate every day, in a tradition that dates back to the early 20th century. The original version included celery, garlic, and parsley. One of the two versions used today includes mashed potatoes. The ham hocks added flavor to the beans, and the whole thing was slow cooked until the meat fell off the bone. It might not have been gourmet, but it was definitely satisfying. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood, as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Wilted lettuce salad is pretty much a traditional Southern dish that got popular around the wartime period. Back then, vegetable-based dishes that were easy to make and had ingredients that weren't costly or rare were prioritized over everything else. These were the kinds of recipes you really wanted to stock up on. To that end, this dish uses dandelion greens, spinach, and Bibb lettuce. A lot of people started to use dandelion greens, especially because you could grow them in your victory gardens back in the day during the Depression and War. Its simple ingredients and its ability to keep you full made this one of the most economical choices to go for in a time when money was short and your pantry was even smaller. With this, you also have a little bit of bacon so that it's not too unfamiliar or vegetable-based for the average American palate. The crumbled bacon gets tossed together, and the salad is served warm, with a crunchy bite and a smoky aftertaste. One thing about the 30s and 40s is that they had a communal spirit way above whatever we have today. Now let's take a little bit of a break from otherwise uncomfortable areas of a cow and go on over to calico scrambled eggs. Not sure what I mean? Calico scrambled eggs were named that pretty much because they were really vibrant and colorful. It was tough to get fresh white or brown eggs because there was just too much of a need on the front lines for them. The war effort could still spare some powdered eggs, though even that had to be stretched. Adding some basic leftover scraps like herbs and vegetables really helped make it last long, but it was the victory gardens that helped the most. A lot of the stuff that you'd typically see in calico scrambled eggs came right out of a victory garden. Bell peppers, onions, potatoes, tomatoes, and even spinach. People really discovered their green thumb during this time period. These weren't just filling, they were comforting and nutritious too. Most food during wartime just didn't consider presentability at all. I mean, no shade to them, it wouldn't even be appropriate to. Still, who can deny that your food tastes a little nicer when it looks pretty too? These scrambled eggs helped people remember the fun of eating a good-looking plate, but didn't really require any kind of time or work spent preparing it, which was really one of the best things about them. Turnip greens were a common green leafy vegetable during the Dust Bowl, when other greens like spinach and lettuce were a rare sight. I guess you can say crops had seen better days, so turnips were cooked down with a little bit of bacon or salt pork for flavor. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. They were often cooked down with a bit of bacon grease or other fat to add flavor and make them more palatable. Whether served as a side dish, added to soups, or mixed into stews, turnip greens help to round out meals and provide essential nutrients. Turnip greens might not be everyone's favorite, but they were a necessary part of the Dust Bowl diet. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. If you ask someone to name one dish that describes diets during the Dust Bowl era, bean soup is the first meal that comes to mind. Beans have been man's best friend through some of the tensest times in history. They've been used in different kinds of meals through thick and thin. Bean soup was the classic bean dish of the 30s. Beans were cheap and easy to store, so they were a staple in many pantries. Bean soup could be made with any type of bean, and it was often thickened with cornmeal or bread. The simplicity of bean soup meant that it could be stretched to feed many people, and it provided a good source of protein and fiber. Bean soup might not have been the most exciting dish, but it was a staple of the Dust Bowl diet for a reason. It provided essential nutrition, was easy to make, and offered a bit of comfort and warmth. It was a reliable and nurturing meal that helped families get through some of the toughest times. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. What about Sally Lunn bread? Have you ever heard of that? I bet it's a little new to you. Otherwise, I'll feel bad for not knowing. This dish was something that we got from our English immigrants that first began to settle down here, and it involves this yeast-leavened bread. It's such a popular item in the States, and it's one of the lightest breads you can ever have. Now, English records talk about an actual Sally Lunn who made this, but recent attempts at trying to verify this always seem to come up short. Basically, nobody knows if there was a legitimate Sally who made the bread, but it's legendary all the same. Its reputation is just as ancient too, since this can be tracked all the way back to the 18th century when the English colonial settlers first came over. It was later popularized again by immigrants, but the very first records of the bread come from this time period. It's sometimes comparable to brioche, but people also think of it as a breakfast bread or something similar to bread pudding. It got widely popular in all kinds of Southern homes as the ideal way to start your morning, and it took next to nothing to bake. All you needed was your typical ratios of butter, sugar, and milk in the dough, and you were pretty much good to go. By the way, it goes great with some tea. Vegetarian chopped liver was a pretty good alternative to the lack of meat overall. I know I also said that liver was a bit more popular thanks to the rationing and the tight supply of meat, but even that would run out at some point. Plus, these aren't concrete facts that apply to every area or neighborhood. Places in the South had a way different focus in regards to their diet than people in California or Washington. Rural neighborhoods definitely couldn't afford meat of any kind, premium cut or bottom-of-the-barrel stuff. Thanks to that, vegetarian food really took off. The scene was pretty much already set for it, with mock food culture constantly proving that you can at least get comfortably close to the flavors you couldn't have. Vegetables were just another way of imitating those same dishes, but this time in a way that doesn't put a hole in your finances. Chopped liver was pretty much a massive staple in Ashkenazi Jewish culture, but they started putting out vegetarian chopped liver recipes thanks to all the shortages, which were extremely regular. Pickling was a common practice during the Dust Bowl, and when you're not sure whether you'll wake up to a fresh harvest of fruits, preserving them is the way to go. And what's a better way of preserving fruits than pickling them? I mean, you could dehydrate nature's sweets, but picking is a whole lot tastier. Pickling involves soaking fruits in a mixture of vinegar, salt, and spices. Fruits like apples, peaches, and even cherries were pickled with sugar and vinegar to create a sweet and tangy treat that could last throughout the year. These pickled fruits were often enjoyed as a side dish or used to add a bit of sweetness to other meals. It's crazy to think that pickled fruits were one of the only sweet treats available during the Dust Bowl era. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Beaten biscuits are typically an American-only concept. They refer to physically pounding the dough with some kind of mallet or rolling pin and then really working that batter over, like as hard as you possibly can. This basically gives it an almost rubber band-like texture with how elastic it becomes, and that makes it really different from your typical biscuit dough. See, that one can barely hold itself together, but this one functions as a whole individual unit. It has all your typical ingredients too, and it's honestly a little cheaper overall since it uses all-purpose flour. In the South and in Appalachian homes, it was pretty common for colonial middle-class homes to make this as a snack or even as a breakfast item. It took way more effort than it was worth, though. Women had to beat the dough for hours and hours until it was ready. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Brace yourself for this dish as it gets a little crazy. Another wartime meal was crow pie. a dish born of necessity during World War II. Crow meat was widely considered a last resort, but desperate times called for creative solutions. The pie filling typically consisted of crow meat, stretched with whatever vegetables or scraps were available, like potatoes, carrots, or even turnips. The crust, often made from flour and water, was a rudimentary attempt to mimic traditional pie dough, as butter and lard were hard to come by. Herbs and seasonings masked the gamey flavor, making the meal more palatable. Crow pie wasn't a delicacy. It was a stark reflection of wartime struggles. It's said the name itself was a bit of a joke, highlighting the irony of turning scavenger birds into dinner. While it might not have resembled anything like the pies of pre-war days, it was filling, cost next to nothing, and made use of an overlooked food source. So, soufflé potatoes are their own little niche corner of Louisiana comfort. A lot of people claim that the origins of this dish come from the days when French cooking had taken over the minds of almost every home chef in America. This is mostly because the way these potatoes are made is a French tradition, but it is one that's been adopted by Louisiana ever since the early days of the 20th century. Here, what you basically do is fry the potatoes twice. Once, you fry them at a low temperature in hot oil, which helps soften the potatoes up. This gives them that lightness that they're so well known for. Then, the second time you fry them, you really turn up the heat and make sure they get a perfectly golden, crunchy exterior. This gives them that airiness they're so used to. It's pretty much one of the most well-received side dishes, and in some restaurants and fine dining circles, even an amazing main course. It's actually really easy to mess this up though, because frying it at just the wrong temperature and being just a little bit off on the timing can be pretty disastrous. You might end up with a burnt soufflé or something that just doesn't feel good to bite into at all. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right, those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Corn oysters are pretty much what happens when nature runs its due course. See, these were always wildly popular in South Carolina and the countryside over there, and for some pretty good reasons. People that live in Carolina have a neat little advantage over others in that they end up right next to a sizable coast. Of course, this means they get all the benefits you'd normally associate with living by the coast too. Namely, a never-ending supply of fresh oysters. Then you have the state's long and pretty colorful history with agriculture, specifically corn. Back in the colonial settler days, Native Americans actually taught most people how to cultivate corn and farm it properly. Why was it such a regional hit? Well, it's not so much a regional thing as much as it is an American thing. Corn is one of the few things that American soil is pretty good for growing, so naturally people were going to take advantage of it wherever they could. It's just smart business, you get what I mean? That's how so many corn dishes became popular. It was either that or starvation for a lot of people. So, what happens when you put two and two together? Corn oysters were such a regional hit exactly because it was so easy for everyone to get them. It didn't matter what your bank looked like, so long as you had a way to the local fish and farmers markets. Pimento cheese spreads were creamy, tangy, and just about the savior that America needed. One thing that's consistent throughout American history is the country's extreme love of cheese. That just doesn't change. Pick any century, and you'll find cheese addicts across every state, which is why the shortages of dairy and cheese really hurt people a lot during the Depression and World War. It wasn't as if a source of fat just vanished. It was like a best friend went away to another country. Imagine if people took cheese out of your diet today. Not a fun scenario, right? Pimento cheese spreads were pretty much the holy grail of wartime cooking because of this. It started when mass-produced cream cheese really started to become a thing and began to use pimentos in it. This was somewhere around the early 1900s, but in the World War, the general recipe got revealed to the public. Now, obviously, people weren't in a position to get cream cheese, but sometimes, on a lucky break, they'd have some cheddar lying around. Pimento cheese spreads were made using that, and they became the lifeline of all kinds of people. Factory workers, students at school, families, rural class neighborhoods. Any sort of community or group you can imagine, I bet they had some fond memories with pimento cheese. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Eggs goldenrod. An interesting name for a dish, don't you think? What's even more of an eye-catcher is the fact that this apparently looks like a goldenrod, the actual flower. Eggs goldenrod were a breakfast dish that pretty much started to become popular throughout the 1950s and 1960s, but also had a resurgence throughout the 80s. In that decade, their reputation existed only as this breakfast dish, which was right out of the cookbooks of the early 50s, and that gave it a lot of pull with a certain crowd. Towards the end of the 20th century, there was this movement of bringing back vintage retro dishes that people had largely forgotten. What really is a goldenrod, though? Well, the dish itself is this really thick mix of egg yolks that are mashed and served over a bechamel sauce. You typically pair this up with toast and call it a day, but some people really go all out with herbs, seasonings, and all kinds of hash browns too. As far as vintage breakfasts go, this is one of the best recipes to pick out from the 20th century. It's also really light and healthy, so it makes for a pretty calorie-conscious breakfast. You get to indulge in some flavors you wouldn't find today on top of keeping that deficit going. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. Supper sub. Avocado toast? That's not what life was like during the Dust Bowl. People were eating cactus fruit and spreading lard. Now you might be wondering, what on earth is a cactus fruit? Well, think of it as nature's candy. These spiny little fruits, also called cactus pears or prickly pears, were produced by cacti and turned into an important staple during the worst days of the Dust Bowl. These spiny wonders would be gathered, skinned, and the sweet and sour pulp could be eaten. Now here's where things get interesting. They didn't just eat cactus fruit by itself. No, sir. Farmers needed to add more substance to it, and that's where lard comes in. Lard, the rendered pig fat that many farm families kept in their pantry. So, they would beat the cactus fruit with a generous dollop of lard, and they could spread it on bread, crackers, or anything that was eatable at that time. It wasn't fancy, but it fed people. Well, Yes, it might sound a little strange now, but cactus fruit contained vitamins and water which was scarce. Well, it goes without saying that where there is a will, there is a way. And this combo is a perfect example of that. Kentucky's Burgoo Fest in Owensboro is actually one of the best things to do in the whole state. The Burgoo Festival is one of the most renowned festivals across the country, and Owensboro itself is known as the Burgoo capital of the world too. The actual history of the burgoo comes from the 19th century African-American communities that first made this into a southern dish. A lot of them were working in plantations and had to really play clever with their ingredients, and this meant that burgoo was something people couldn't live without. That only got worse when the Civil War rolled around and people started incorporating the recipe into the mainstream due to its ability to feed massive groups of people. The burgoo itself is this really thick and dense stew that has mashed potatoes, chicken, and all kinds of vegetables. You know those little quirks that each state has? The kind of thing that it becomes popular for, that everyone starts recognizing it for? That's basically what this was. Which poverty meal will you teach your kids first? Drop it in the comments and share the recipes your family refused to let die. Hit like if these meals brought back memories, and subscribe so we can keep passing down the dishes big corporations wish you'd forget.